The road stretched endlessly, a narrow ribbon cutting through the forest's looming darkness. Anna Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the pale beam of her car's headlights slicing through the night. The forest pressed in on either side, trees standing like silent sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the thick, swirling fog. She glanced at her GPS screen again, its signal long gone. The blinking searching for service icon had mocked her for miles now, leaving her to rely on the vague instructions her editor had emailed. Left at the old stone bridge, right after the fork in the road. That had been over 15 minutes ago, and now there was nothing but the endless, twisting road. The car's heater hummed softly, offering little comfort against the biting chill that seemed to seep in through the very walls of the vehicle. Anna shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the growing unease creeping up her spine. The trees outside seemed unnaturally still, their skeletal forms shrouded in shadows that stretched and danced whenever her headlights passed. When the road finally widened into a clearing, Anna let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ahead of her stood Mountain Key Inn, its imposing silhouette outlined against the stark glow of the moon. The building was massive, built of weathered gray stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its steep gables and narrow windows gave it the air of a forgotten relic, a place that belonged more to the pages of a Gothic novel than the real world. A row of wrought iron lanterns lined the gravel driveway, their dim, flickering flames doing little to dispel the shadows that clung to the building. Anna parked her car and stepped out, the cold mountain air biting at her face and hands. The faint smell of damp earth and pine mingled with something metallic, sharp and unpleasant, though she couldn't place its source. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she approached the inn's entrance. The heavy oak door loomed before her, its surface adorned with intricate carvings and a brass lion head knocker. She hesitated, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass of the window beside the door. The dim light made her features appear distorted, almost unrecognizable, as if the reflection belonged to someone else entirely. Anna shook off the thought and lifted the knocker, letting it fall with a hollow thud that echoed into the stillness. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman standing in the dimly lit threshold. "Miss Carter," the woman said, her voice sharp yet oddly flat. "Welcome to Mountain Key Inn. We've been expecting you." Anna managed a weak smile. "Thank you. It's been quite a drive." The woman nodded stiffly and stepped aside, gesturing for Anna to enter. "Follow me to the front desk, and we'll get you checked in." Inside, the inn was just as imposing as its exterior. The grand foyer stretched upward to a vaulted ceiling, where a dusty chandelier hung, its crystal pendants catching the faint light and casting fragmented shadows across the room. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, interrupted by faded portraits whose subjects seemed to watch Anna with unnerving intensity. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she followed the woman to a massive mahogany desk. On it rested an old-fashioned brass bell and a leather-bound guest book, its cracked covers speaking to decades of use. "Please sign in," the woman said, sliding the guest book toward Anna and handing her an ink pen. Anna hesitated, her fingers brushing over the book's worn surface. When she opened it, her eyes froze on the page. There, in elegant cursive, was her name, Anna Carter. The date beside it was 3 days earlier. A chill ran down her spine. "This must be some kind of mistake," she said, looking up at the woman. "I've never been here before." The woman's face remained expressionless, her eyes cold and unreadable. "The guest book doesn't make mistakes, Miss Carter. Your room is ready." Anna stared at the woman, unsure how to respond. Something about the way she said it made the words feel less like reassurance and more like an ominous warning. Her room was on the second floor, down a narrow hallway lined with worn carpet and more portraits. The faces in the frames were faded, their features indistinct, yet Anna couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her. When she reached room 207, the brass number on the door gleamed faintly in the dim light. Inside, the room was quaint but eerily quiet. A heavy 4-poster bed stood against one wall, its canopy draped with dusty curtains. A vintage mirror hung above the dresser, its glass slightly fogged. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of lavender and something acrid beneath it. Anna set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed. The day's drive had left her exhausted, but her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the guest book and the inexplicable presence of her name. Maybe it was just a clerical error, she told herself. Some strange coincidence. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. As she lay down and pulled the covers over herself, the room seemed to grow colder. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards, as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond the door. Anna woke to the sound of faint knocking. Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding, as she tried to orient herself. The room was dark, save for the dim light of the bedside lamp she'd left on. The knocking came again, soft but insistent, like someone tapping at the door with their fingertips. She hesitated, straining her ears to confirm she wasn't imagining it. Slowly, she slid out of bed and approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the empty, dimly lit hallway. The knocking stopped. "Hello," she called softly, her voice trembling. No answer. Anna stood frozen for a moment before finally returning to bed. She tried to convince herself it was just the old building settling, though the explanation felt hollow. Sleep didn't come easily after that, and when it finally did, her dreams were filled with shadows and faint whispers she couldn't understand. The next morning, she woke to the sound of birds faintly chirping outside. Daylight filtered weakly through the heavy curtains, casting the room in a pale, gray light. She felt groggy, her body heavy with exhaustion. The events of the night before lingered in her mind, but the brightening day provided a small sense of relief. After a quick shower, she decided to head downstairs for breakfast. The inn's dining room was a grand space, its large bay windows revealing a breathtaking view of the forested hills. The morning fog still clung to the trees, curling like ghostly tendrils around their trunks. There were only a handful of other guests scattered around the room, each sitting alone at small, round tables. They were all strangely quiet, their gazes fixed on their food or the window. No one spoke, and the clinking of silverware on plates was the only sound that filled the air. Anna took a seat by the window and was soon approached by a young man in a server's uniform. His face was pale, his eyes hollow as if he hadn't slept in days. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, please," Anna said, forcing a polite smile. "Do you have a menu?" He nodded silently and handed her a small card with faded print. As Anna skimmed it, she tried to make small talk. "This is a beautiful place," she said. "How long have you worked here?" The man stiffened slightly, his eyes darting toward the far corner of the room. I've been here a while," he said, his voice faltering. "Long enough." Before Anna could press further, he hurried away. She noticed that he didn't approach any of the other tables. After breakfast, Anna decided to explore the inn. The unsettling quiet of the dining room had left her with more questions than answers, and she hoped that wandering the building might distract her. She started with the library, a grand room filled with towering bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the faint sunlight streaming through the tall windows. As she browsed the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of old, leather-bound books, her attention was drawn to a table near the center of the room. On it rested another guest book, its cracked leather cover eerily similar to the one at the front desk. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. The first page was blank, as was the second. But on the third page, her name appeared. Anna Carter. The date was from last year. Her breath caught in her throat. She flipped through the pages, finding her name repeated over and over, each time with a different date. Some entries were from decades ago, others from just a few months prior. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered to herself. Her hands trembled as she slammed the book shut. The sound echoed loudly in the empty room, making her jump. Anna made her way to the front desk, clutching the second guest book tightly. The elderly woman from the previous night was there, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "What is this?" Anna demanded, slamming the book onto the counter. "Why is my name in here? I've never been here before." The woman looked down at the book, her gaze lingering for a moment before meeting Anna's eyes. "The inn keeps its own records," she said simply. "What does that even mean?" Anna's voice rose. "You expect me to believe some supernatural explanation for this? Who's been writing my name in these books?" The woman's lips thinned. "The inn calls to those who belong to it. You've been here before, Ms. Carter. Many times." Anna's stomach twisted. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "I would remember." The woman's expression softened, almost pitying. "Would you?" Before Anna could respond, the faint sound of knocking echoed through the room. Her blood ran cold. It was the same soft, insistent knocking she had heard the night before. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The woman stepped back. "You should rest, Miss Carter. Room 207 is waiting for you." Anna stormed back to her room, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the woman's cryptic words. "The inn calls to those who belong to it. You've been here before." The guest book entries haunted her thoughts, each date raising more questions than answers. How could her name appear in records dating back decades? And why did no one seem surprised by it except her? Room 207 was cold when she returned, the air heavy and stagnant. She closed the door and locked it, then dragged a chair under the handle for good measure. Her laptop sat on the small desk by the window, a blinking cursor on the blank document taunting her. She sat down, determined to channel her anxiety into productivity. But the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts were too scattered, the events of the day refusing to settle into any logical order. She glanced at the mirror above the dresser. Its surface was slightly fogged, distorting her reflection. Something about it unnerved her. The longer she stared, the more her image seemed off. Her posture looked different, her head tilted at an angle she hadn't moved to. She blinked and turned away, deciding to focus on her work. The night deepened, and with it, the unease in the room seemed to grow. Anna kept her bedside lamp on, the warm glow offering some semblance of comfort. She had given up on writing, retreating to the bed with her phone, scrolling mindlessly through old photos to distract herself. That's when she heard it again, the knocking. It started softly, the same deliberate tapping she'd heard the night before. This time, however, it was accompanied by something else, a faint whispering just on the edge of hearing. The sound sent a chill down her spine. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The knocking stopped. The whispering grew louder, though the words were still indecipherable. It wasn't coming from the door. It sounded as though it was coming from the walls themselves. Anna scrambled off the bed and pressed her ear to the cold wood of the door. The hallway outside was silent. The whispering, however, continued, now seeming to come from the mirror. She turned, her gaze locking onto the fogged surface. The room behind her reflected dimly in the glass, but her own image was nowhere to be seen. A surge of panic gripped her. She grabbed the heavy throw blanket from the bed and draped it over the mirror, covering it entirely. The whispering stopped. Hours passed in restless silence. Anna lay curled on the bed, every creak of the old building setting her nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were vivid and strange. She stood in the grand foyer, the chandelier's light flickering ominously above her. The elderly woman from the front desk stood behind the counter, smiling faintly as Anna flipped through a guest book. Each page bore her name, written over and over, the dates growing older the farther she turned. When she reached the final page, it was blank except for one word scrawled in bold letters: forever. Anna awoke with a start, her heart hammering in her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign that something was amiss. The mirror remained covered, the chair still propped against the door. But something felt wrong, off, as though the room was subtly different from how it had been before she slept. The next morning, Anna descended to the dining room, her head clouded from a restless night. She avoided the mirror in the room as she got ready, unwilling to risk seeing whatever it was she had seen or hadn't seen. The dining room was nearly empty when she arrived, save for a single guest seated by the window. He was an older man, his back to her, dressed in a suit that looked decades out of style. Anna sat at a small table across the room and waited for the server, but none appeared. "Good morning," Anna said, trying to sound casual as she addressed the man. He didn't respond. After a moment of hesitation, she approached him. "Excuse me." She froze mid-sentence. The man's chair was empty. The teacup before him was full, steam rising from it, as if he'd just been sitting there. The sound of footsteps drew her attention to the doorway. It was the elderly woman from the front desk. Her eyes seemed sharper this morning, her expression colder. "Sleep well?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. Anna ignored the question. "Is there anyone else staying here?" The dining room's been empty both mornings. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. "We don't get many guests these days. You'll find things quieter than you expected, I'm sure." "What about the man who was just sitting here?" Anna asked, gesturing toward the empty table. "I saw him a moment ago." The woman's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure you're mistaken." Anna opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. She was beginning to question her own perceptions. The events of the past 24 hours, the guest book, the mirror, the knocking, were wearing on her. Maybe she had imagined the man. Maybe she just needed rest. That afternoon, Anna returned to the library, desperate for answers. The guest book she'd found the previous day still sat on the table where she'd left it. She opened it again, flipping through the pages. Her name appeared over and over, some entries dating back to the early 1900s. "How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A sudden creak behind her made her whirl around. No one was there, but the air in the room felt charged, heavy with a presence she couldn't see. The chandelier overhead flickered, and a shadow moved across the far wall, though nothing in the room could have cast it. Anna slammed the book shut and fled, her pulse racing. She was no longer sure whether the inn was haunted or if she was losing her mind. Either way, she couldn't stay. Anna's decision to leave the inn was final. She couldn't shake the feeling that the building was playing tricks on her, or worse, that her own mind was unraveling. After fleeing the library, she returned to her room and packed hastily. Every sound seemed amplified. The soft groan of the old wood underfoot, the faint rustle of wind outside her window, and, beneath it all, the ever-present silence that hung over the inn like a thick fog. As she zipped up her suitcase, her eyes fell on the mirror still draped with the throw blanket. A nagging part of her urged her to take one last look. Maybe, she thought, if she confronted whatever she had seen or imagined, she could leave without feeling like she was running away. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the edge of the blanket. Then in one swift motion, she pulled it off. The mirror's surface was clearer than it had been the day before, polished to a pristine shine. For a moment, it reflected nothing but the room behind her, empty and still. Then slowly her own image came into view. She stared at herself, at her tired eyes and pale face, and let out a shaky laugh. "Just my imagination," she whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. But the reflection didn't move. Her breath hitched as she froze, her hand trembling an inch from the surface. The Anna in the mirror remained still, her expression blank and lifeless. Her eyes locked on Anna's face with unsettling intensity. Then, her reflection's lips moved, forming words Anna couldn't hear. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her suitcase. Her reflection's mouth continued to move, faster now, as though it were desperately trying to tell her something. "No, Anna whispered. This isn't real." The reflection froze, its mouth hanging open. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it raised its hand and pointed to the door behind her. Anna whirled around. The door to room 207 was open. Her chest tightened as a wave of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispering. She stared at the empty doorway, her mind screaming at her to leave. But her feet moved on their own, stepping cautiously toward the hall. The corridor outside was dim, the flickering sconces casting long shadows on the walls. It stretched endlessly in both directions, far longer than it had been before. She looked to her left, then her right, but there was no sign of the staircase or any other doors. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing strangely. No response came, but the whispering grew louder, echoing from all around her. She turned back toward her room, only to find the door gone. In its place was a blank wall. Her breathing quickened. She pressed her hands against the cold surface where the door had been, as though willing it to reappear. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a chaotic murmur that seemed to come from the very walls. Suddenly, a familiar sound pierced through the noise, the soft, rhythmic knocking she had heard the previous nights. It was closer now, directly behind her. Anna turned slowly, her body trembling. At the end of the impossibly long corridor, a figure stood in the shadows. It was indistinct, its form flickering like a poorly tuned signal. "Who's there?" Anna demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It seemed to grow darker, its edges sharper, as though the shadows themselves were coalescing around it. Then, it began to walk toward her. Anna stumbled backward, her heart racing. The walls of the corridor seemed to close in, the air thickening around her. The figure advanced slowly, its footsteps eerily silent. As it drew closer, she could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its features were a blur, a swirling void where a face should have been. She turned and ran, her boots pounding against the warped floor. The corridor twisted and shifted around her, leading her in circles. No matter how far she ran, the figure remained behind her, always at the same distance. Anna's flight ended abruptly when she burst through a set of heavy double doors into the foyer. She nearly collapsed, gasping for breath as she looked around. The chandelier above flickered erratically, casting wild shadows across the walls. The guest book still sat on the desk, its cover slightly ajar. Anna approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she flipped it open. Her name stared back at her, written dozens, no, hundreds of times. Each entry was paired with a date, and the most recent one was today. Her vision blurred with panic as she turned the page. The next entry was blank, but the pen beside the book seemed to tremble, as if waiting for her to fill it in. "No," she whispered, slamming the book shut. "I'm leaving." "You can't leave," a voice said behind her. Anna spun around to see the elderly woman standing at the foot of the staircase. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "What is this place?" Anna demanded. "What's happening to me?" The woman stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "You've always been here, Miss Carter. The inn doesn't take people by chance. It only calls to those who belong." "I don't belong here," Anna said, backing away. "You're lying." "Am I?" the woman asked, tilting her head. "Tell me, Miss Carter, where were you before you came here? What brought you to us?" Anna opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Her memories were a haze, fragments of her life before the end slipping through her fingers like sand. The drive through the forest, the reason for her visit, it all felt distant, unreal. "You've always been here," the woman repeated softly, "and you always will be." Anna stumbled back from the woman, shaking her head violently. "No, this isn't real. This isn't possible." The woman remained eerily calm, her cold eyes unblinking. "Reality is subjective, Miss Carter. What you see here, what you feel, this is yours. You made this place." Anna's breath quickened as she clutched the edge of the desk for support. "I didn't make anything. You're insane. This whole place is insane." "Denial is common," the woman said, her voice steady. "But you'll come to understand. You've come close before." The words hit in like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to shout that none of it was true. But the woman's gaze, unrelenting and almost pitying, made her pause. A flicker of doubt crept in. Had she been here before? The memories of her life outside the inn were increasingly fragmented, like faded photographs she could no longer make sense of. Anna turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, just away. The hallways twisted and stretched before her, their walls narrowing and expanding as though alive. Every corner she turned seemed to lead her back to where she had started. Doors lined the halls, each bearing a brass number, but when she tried to open them, they were locked or led only to blank walls. The whispers returned, growing louder with every step she took. They spoke her name now, echoing through the halls like a chant. "Anna, Anna, Anna." She burst into the dining room, her pulse racing. The tables were empty, the air thick with a musty stillness. The man she had seen the day before was sitting at the far end, his back to her once again. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please tell me what's going on." The man didn't move. His hand was poised over the teacup, perfectly still. Desperate, Anna moved closer, her steps hesitant. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why won't you answer me?" She reached out to touch his shoulder, but as her fingers brushed the fabric of his jacket, he dissolved into shadow. The chair creaked as it slid back, empty. Anna stumbled away, her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers grew louder. Anna whirled around, searching for the source, but the room seemed to fold in on itself. The walls stretched upward, the chandelier above swaying violently. The inn structure groaned and creaked as though it were alive. The elderly woman appeared in the doorway, her expression as composed as ever. "You can't run from this, Miss Carter. You've tried before." Anna clenched her fists, anger flaring through her panic. "I don't belong here. I have a life, people waiting for me. Let me leave." The woman raised a hand, pointing to the guest book still clutched in Anna's trembling hand. "That is your life now. The inn doesn't just hold you, it becomes you. Every name in that book is a part of this place, woven into its walls, its air. You're no different." Anna shook her head furiously. "No, I'll find a way out. I don't care what you say." "Go ahead," the woman said, stepping aside. "Try, but you'll see the truth soon enough." Determined to escape, Anna bolted past the woman and out into the foyer. The front door stood before her, its brass handle gleaming in the dim light. She grabbed it and yanked, but the door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, throwing her weight against it, but it was as though the door was fused to the frame. She turned to the windows. The glass reflected the room behind her, but no matter how hard she struck at it with a chair, it didn't crack. Her reflection stared back, distorted and wrong, its expression twisted into something she didn't recognize. Panicking, Anna ran to the staircase and ascended to the second floor, hoping to find another way out. But every hallway led her back to room 207. The door was open, the room inside dark and uninviting. "Come in," a voice whispered from within. Anna froze. The voice wasn't the woman's, it was her own. Against her better judgment, Anna stepped into the room. It looked the same as before, yet something felt profoundly different. The mirror above the dresser was no longer fogged. It gleamed with unsettling clarity, and her reflection stood in it, staring at her with a faint, knowing smile. "You can't leave," her reflection said, its lips moving out of sync with her own. "You're part of it now." "I'm not," Anna whispered, backing away. "I'm not part of anything." The reflection tilted its head, its movements fluid and unnatural. "Haven't you figured it out yet? You always come back. You've been here longer than you can remember." "No," Anna said, her voice rising. "That's not true. I just got here." Her reflection's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than her own. "Think, Anna, how many times have you written this story?" The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, memories flashing through her mind. Snippets of her sitting at the desk, typing the same scene over and over. Arriving at the inn, signing the guest book, trying to leave. Anna turned toward the door, but it had vanished again, leaving her trapped. The whispers in the walls grew deafening, merging into a single voice, her own. The mirror loomed behind her, its surface rippling like water. Her reflection reached out, its hand breaking through the glass. Anna screamed as the hand grasped her wrist, pulling her toward the mirror. "You belong here," her reflection said, its voice echoing in her ears. "And you always will." The mirror pulled at Anna, its surface rippling like liquid mercury as her reflection dragged her closer. She screamed, fighting against the impossible strength of the hand grasping her wrist. Her boots scraped against the floor, but there was no escape. The whispers in the walls rose to a deafening cacophony, a chaotic symphony of voices repeating her name. "Stop!" Anna begged, her voice hoarse. "Let me go." Her reflection smiled coldly, its grip tightening. "You can't escape yourself. With one final tug, the reflection yanked her through the glass. Anna's world twisted and folded as she was swallowed by the mirror. For a moment, she felt weightless, suspended in a void of shimmering darkness. Then, the sensation of falling overwhelmed her, and she landed hard on a cold, smooth surface. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in a distorted version of room 207. The walls stretched impossibly high, their edges melting into shadow. The furniture was warped, its angles sharp and wrong. The mirror stood before her, its surface now solid and impenetrable. Her reflection was gone. Anna turned, her breath catching in her throat. The room behind her was filled with figures. They stood motionless, their faces blurred and indistinct, their forms flickering like poorly tuned images. She realized with a sickening lurch that she recognized some of them. The man from the dining room, the young server, even the elderly woman from the front desk. All of them were here, trapped in this twisted version of the inn. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Anna took a step back, her pulse racing. The figures didn't move, but their presence felt suffocating. She turned back to the mirror, pounding on its surface. "Let me out," she screamed. "Please." But the glass didn't budge. Her own voice echoed back at her, mocking and hollow. As she backed away, the figures began to shift. One by one, they turned toward her, their faceless heads tilting unnaturally. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if the air around them resisted their every motion. Anna's panic surged. "Stay away," she shouted, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond. Instead, they began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into wisps of shadow that floated toward her. She tried to run, but the shadows surrounded her, their cold tendrils wrapping around her body. They seeped into her skin, filling her with an icy numbness that spread through her veins. Memories flooded her mind, disjointed, fragmented images of the inn, of herself signing the guest book, of endless corridors and locked doors. She saw herself over and over, arriving at the inn, staying in room 207, and trying to escape. The same sequence, repeated again and again. Suddenly, she was back in the grand foyer. The chandelier above swayed gently, its light casting soft shadows across the walls. The desk stood before her, the guest book lying open. Anna blinked, her body trembling. Everything seemed normal. The hallways were no longer impossibly long, and the oppressive silence had lifted. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see the marks of the shadows that had consumed her, but they were clean, whole. Cautiously, she stepped toward the desk. The guest book sat open to a blank page, the pen lying beside it. Her heart sank as she realized what was expected of her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't do it." But her hand moved on its own, her fingers curling around the pen. She fought against the motion, her body trembling with the effort, but it was useless. Her hand hovered over the blank page, and with slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote her name, Anna Carter. The ink sank into the paper, dark and final. The moment she finished, the book snapped shut, and a wave of cold washed over her. She staggered back, gasping for air. The sound of the front door creaking open drew her attention. She turned to see a young woman stepping into the foyer, her face pale and tired. She carried a suitcase, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Anna opened her mouth to speak, to warn the woman to leave, but no sound came out. The elderly woman from the front desk appeared, her sharp features softened by a faint smile. "Welcome," she said to the newcomer. "We've been expecting you." Anna's heart sank as she realized. She was no longer a guest. She moved instinctively toward the desk, her body unresponsive to her own commands. Her voice was silent, her steps light but automatic, as if she had become part of the inn itself. The young woman hesitated by the door, glancing around uncertainly, her suitcase held tightly in one hand. "Ms. Harper," the elderly woman said warmly, "your room is ready. Please sign the guest book." Anna's breath caught as the newcomer's hand hovered over the pen. She wanted to scream, to tell her to run, but the words were trapped inside her. Instead, she found herself stepping behind the desk, standing beside the elderly woman as if she had always been there. The guest book opened on its own, revealing a fresh, blank page. The woman named Harper hesitated, glancing at Anna, her brow furrowing as though she sensed something was wrong. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and Anna felt an overwhelming rush of familiarity, as though she had stood in this exact spot countless times before. "Please," the elderly woman urged gently, "don't keep the in waiting." The pen moved, Harper's name etching itself onto the page. The room seemed to exhale, the oppressive silence lifting for a moment. The young woman was ushered toward the stairs, her steps hesitant but inevitable. As she disappeared down the hall, Anna turned to the elderly woman, desperate for answers she already knew she wouldn't receive. "Why?" Anna whispered, her voice finally returning, though it sounded distant, hollow. "Why me? Why any of us?" The woman smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "Because the inn remembers. It needs you, just as you need it. The stories must continue." Anna's heart sank as understanding dawned. The loop wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had come before and everyone who would come after. Each guest became part of the inn, feeding its endless hunger for lives, memories, and souls. That night, Anna sat at the desk in room 207, staring at the blank page on her laptop. Her reflection in the mirror behind her watched with calm detachment as she typed the first words of her story. The road stretched endlessly, a narrow ribbon cutting through the forest's looming darkness. Anna Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The words flowed effortlessly, as though she had written them 1,000 times before. Far below, in the foyer, the guest book sat waiting. Its pages turned slowly, seemingly on their own, revealing the next blank page. And above it, the pen trembled, eager for the next name. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.